This is for the rotten kid. The forgotten kid. I didn't get any attention, so I'm going to do something so over the top that no one will ever top it, kid. I'm just reading my book. Come on. Leave me alone. Stop it, kid. The kid who saw too much too soon and didn't know how to talk about it. There's a kid right now in the back room of a one-floor ranch with a pad of paper and imagination cradled in both hands, living with a bunch of people that are going to tell them that they can't. So we defy expectation to show the ratio in chance, but you must understand. Sit until you get my explanation. I demand somebody accountable for this misinformation. Why do we push useless propaganda into use faces? Why do they tell us not to be artists unless we want to live in our parents' basement? If you're creative, save it. We'll get you into marketing where you can learn to advertise and brainwash instead of pulling heartstrings. They'll open up your chest, remove the unneeded parts. See? I guess that's why they say business can be a little bit disheartening. It's for that kid. Fat kids. One shoved in the back kids. The kids nobody talked to over something stupid like bad acne. The ones that hurt so bad they said, sure, they laugh at me, but I got to try something new. I have 0 people and I'm unhappy. That's why we write poems that call out problems but try to solve them. The ones that take your misconceptions about life, break them down, and help dissolve them. I'd like us to do better rather than to be tethered to our problems. I'd like to uplift. But if I can't do that, maybe these words can be a shoulder when you need to lean on one. That's why this is for the voiceless. It's for everyone who needs social change but's too broke to afford it. Every important news story that never got reported. Every child with better life here that you want deported. Every criminal who'd be indicted if the crime had been recorded. It's for the dissonance. Murdering Christians and double standards. For the lessons you can't learn, answers not earned on mobile scantrons. For the one child left alone by a drone strike. Robo master. For every issue that you comment on with your logic so very backwards. It's for hatred. Racists. Bigots. Impatience for time lapsed. Photographs that would show the destruction in our faces. This is for the past. The pain, sepia tone sunshine in the month of May. And for that moment when you lose someone and say, come on. Just one more day. It's for the moments. The deep breath and the exhale. The time you finally decided to untie, untether, and set sail. For that moment you realized you weren't rotten. You were brave enough and you meant well. I wrote this for myself. I hope you can't tell. Thank you. My name is Benjamin Brindise. I am a fiction writer and a poet and a teaching artist at the Just Buffalo Literary Center. And real quick before I start, I just want to say thank you to Kelly and Beth for all the work that you put in to help me put this talk together, and to Dana for helping me really structure this out, because I'm the type of person that moves around a lot, and if they left me to my own devices, I'd kind of just be running off on tangents the entire morning. So it's been really nice to have some people help me base this together. The reason I opened with that poem, that was the first time as a writer that I was really being honest. It was the first time that I felt myself actually come out of a poem. Now, it is not by far the most honest or most transparent poem I ever wrote, but it was the starting point. It was the start of something, start of a journey that I've been on since writing that poem to find a way to bring myself out of the artist. I've been really lucky to have friends who have traveled all over the country. And in 2013, my friend Alex came back from New Orleans, and he said, I saw this thing. It was awesome. And I was just like, okay, well, what was it, Alex? And he said, it was a poetry slam. And I was like, what is a poetry slam? And he said, well, I don't really know. He said, it's kind of like a rap battle, but not really. And I was just like, well, that sounds interesting. So he said, let's go. He found one in Buffalo, and it was the Peering Poetry Slam. And we went down there, and I walked into Merge on Delaware. And I'm from West Seneca, so I never spent a lot of time downtown. So for me, at that time, it was like, oh man, this place is awesome. What's going on? And I walk in, and there's all of these people and they have these piles of paper, and they're sitting there reading them, and I'm just like, what is going on in here? And then all of a sudden, as the event started, these people started getting up on stage, and they're just eviscerating themselves, just pulling themselves out and giving it to these people in the audience. And my first reaction to that was, well, this is kind of corny. I don't want to hear about how someone got bullied or had a tough life. It just sounded like a lot of complaining. And I set out to write poems that were the opposite of that when I first started. And as I was going through this process and I was starting to realize the strength in what these people were doing, I found myself looking in a mirror. And I realized that the reason I didn't like the topics that they were picking, I didn't like the topics that they were talking about, was because I've spent my entire life shoving myself into a box. I didn't want people to see those parts of me. I wanted to put them into these little shapes and stuff them away and put them in my closet and cover them with clothes and never look at them again. I didn't like what they were saying because it was the things I wanted to say and didn't feel able to. I didn't feel like I had a place to do those things. I spent 2 years writing poems that were the opposite of transparency. I wanted so badly to tell somebody something that would uplift them or make them feel good or make them feel better or inspire them in some way. And all I was doing was being a phony. And after 2 years of doing these poems, people would come up to me and they would say things like, oh, I really relate to that. Oh, that really helped me. And I didn't feel good about that because it wasn't me. All of a sudden, I had tried to create these things that were authentic and that were real and that would help people, and all I had done was create a costume, a mask, something that was easy to swallow. It wasn't hard. I had put myself into a box with a bow on it that I could hand to people, and they could go home, and that would be great. At a certain point, I realized this was the opposite of what I wanted to be doing. I started writing Rotten Kid, the first poem that I did today, in an attempt to actually speak for and to other people. I wrote that entire poem, and it ended in 2 completely different lines. The last 2 lines of the first draft of that poem were, I wrote this for you. I hope you can tell. And as I was reading this poem over and over again, trying to figure out what was good about it, I started to realize that those weren't the last 2 lines of the poem. I wasn't writing this for somebody else. I was writing this for myself. All of the things that I was trying to say I'm here for you for, I was trying to say I'm here for you, for me. And changing those 2 lines changed the entire trajectory of what my course of being a writer would be. Now, I think the reason that I did this was because there were things in my life that I didn't want to face. I didn't want to admit to. My father is a collection of stories, basically a myth. There are things about him that I don't often tell people, one of which is that he was a great auto mechanic. The 4 days that I spent with him in my life, I watched him take a Jeep apart, take the doors off, strip them down. Hours later, I came outside and it was all put back together again. I was blown away. How is that possible? How can you do that? He grew up in the Bronx, and he worked in a mechanic shop. But he was the type of guy that would work on a Rolls Royce and then drive it to Florida for the weekend, and then drive it back and figure out a way to dial the mileage back so no one knew. He was the type of guy that when he was a cook in Jamaica, and they asked him, Brian, what is snow like? He said, come here. And he walked them over to the freezer, and he opened it, and he had them put their head in, and said, that's what snow's like. My father is a collection of stories. He was also a Mensa member. I don't know if any of these things are true. These are things people have told me. And they create a shadow when there's nothing there for the sun to cast off of. It's an empty shadow. And as I was going through this process of figuring out that I wanted to talk about things that actually affected me in a different way, I found that these were the types of things that I was avoiding. I didn't want to figure out if these things were true or not. I didn't want to figure out how much these things had affected me. So I put a mask over it. And I put myself in a box, and I shoved it in the closet, and I never looked at it again. I was very lucky at a certain point to come across a group of different writers. And when I first got into doing slam, that idea that I talked about in the beginning of not wanting to complain, of not wanting to open up, of not wanting to be somebody who was real on stage, of not being a character, I had people around me that supported that idea. They did the same thing. We were all, in a different way, opaque. Transparency is being seen through. It's also being understood. If you can create a pane of glass that people can cast light through and there are no shadows, that's transparency. We were opaque at best. At best. If you cast light through us, nothing came out the other side because we were a collection of stories. We often talk about not becoming like our parents or becoming better or taking a step. And at that moment, after I had talked with all these different people, I started to realize I was doing the opposite of that. As time went on and I wrote Rotten Kid, I brought it to this group of people. And they said to me, "This isn't very good. I don't really know where you're going with this. It's kind of uncomfortable. I don't like it." So I shelved that poem for a year. I worked on it in secret. I didn't tell anybody about it. And I had a completely different performance when I first did it live in front of people. And it was the people that would never come up and talk to me after a show that started to come up and talk to me after I would do that poem. I did a guest speaking bit at Tapestry Charter School, and I did Rotten Kid. And one kid came up to me afterwards, and he had tears in his eyes. And he said, "No one has ever made me feel that way before. No one has ever made me feel like someone else felt the way I do." And he started to cry a little bit. And I said, "Come on, let's take a walk." And we walked through the halls of Tapestry Charter School. And he told me his story, which, isn't mine to tell for everybody else, but he was affected in a way that I realized this is what I want to do. Being a character on stage, being this cartoon that makes people laugh and is real jittery and is like funny in some sort of way, that's great, but it's entertainment. And I wasn't an entertainer, I was a poet. I wrote fiction first. I think I wrote fiction first because my father was a collection of stories. I was very, very comfortable lying. Very comfortable. And these stories were a way for me to write out these things that I wanted to tell people but couldn't. Fiction in and of itself is a quest to find the truth inside the lie. I was very comfortable lacing lies all around what was my truth. So finally, as I was working on this poem and I had these experiences that I started to realize this is what I'm supposed to be doing, I found a different group of people. And these two other writers brought me into their workshop, and they said, without really saying it, they made me feel this is valuable. There is something here worth telling people. You have something to give to people that you haven't done yet. It was the first time that I felt a support system. It was the first time that I felt comfortable enough to open up, to tell people the truth. And it was a beautiful, beautiful experience. We moved through working on these different poems that we were going to take to the National Poetry Slam, which was actually back in August of this year in Georgia. I was so nervous because of what had been put in my head about that first poem that I didn't even want to do it. And they just kept telling me, "No, do this. This is good. You are good." I needed that. I needed that so badly. And that support system was the first step of really opening myself up. I ran a show for 2 years called Living Poets Society. Our last show was in November of 2015 at Shea Smith Theater. And when we were done, another artist in the community was nice enough to write a review for us. And when she wrote this review, in the opening paragraph, she said that she had an aversion to being earnest. She had spent her entire life avoiding earnestness. In my opinion, the opposite of earnestness is cynicism. After reading that article, that line stuck in my head for some reason. And for months, it kept coming up and I kept thinking about it. I'd always identified with cynics. I loved the idea of looking at hypocritical points of view and thinking like this isn't the way that it should be. And as I went through this process and I read that quote and it kept sticking in my head over and over and over again, I kept asking myself, do you also have an aversion to earnestness? Is that why you're having such a hard time going through this thing or telling people something real or being open? And I started to realize that yes, that's exactly what it was. I had an aversion to earnestness. I would have never known that had I not been able to get out with the support of these people or go through these experiences. After that stuck in my head, I started to write things differently. I said, don't care. Don't worry. Don't worry about what other people are thinking. Don't worry about it. Tell your story. So I decided to try to open up and do that. So after going through the review that Tara was so nice to write for us for that event, going through the workshop with my other poet friends, there was a last moment that really solidified that this quest that I was on was the right path to be taking. We were at Nationals this year in Georgia, and one of the young poets who was going for his first time, they have an event called a rookie open mic. I had missed mine the year before, and I was like, no, I want you to go to this. You're going to meet so many people. It's going to be great. So he went, and he did a poem. And after he was done, this other poet from Orlando had come up to us, and he said, Tom, I just really have to tell you this. I loved the poem you chose. And Tom was like, oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Why do you feel that way? And he said, all these other people had come up and talked about something either that had happened, a political issue, something that had happened in their lives, or whatever. And he said, when they read those poems, I know something about them, but I don't know them. The poem you chose about being 20 and that being good enough for now told me who you were. Those three things combined, the review, the workshopping, and then that moment where another poet came up and said that, I started to realize that this is the right path to take. I'm going somewhere positive. During the course of us getting ready for the National Poetry Slam this year, I wrote the most honest poem that I've ever written. It was hard. It was very, very hard. It was very, very personal, and I was terrified to get up in front of people and tell this story for them. Based on everything that we had gone through, I couldn't let my team down. So I said, I'm going to do this no matter what. We got to that moment, and we were all grouped around, and we were talking to each other, and we were saying, this is it. This is everything that we've trained for and practiced for. It's ready to go, and it's time to go and do this as effectively as we can. And I was nervous, and I was sweating. We were in semifinals. Buffalo's never gone that far. It was a big deal. There were all these other factors coming in from all these other angles, and I had a hard time centering myself. And when the moment came and my name got called and I had to go up there, something happened. All of these things, all of these disconnected moments that we've kind of talked about throughout this entire talk, all of them collided into one moment. And you never think you're going to have a moment like that. You think these are things that just happen in movies or TV shows or books. And in that moment, all of the boxes that I had separated myself into, all of these small compartments that I wouldn't let touch each other, all of these stories that made me who I was came together. The walls came down, and I wasn't afraid. I looked at them, my team, and I realized I could do this. There was nothing stopping me. I've never felt more whole or more human or more real or alive than in that moment. Had I not gone down that path for transparency, had I not had all these different experiences happen to me, I would have never been there. I would have never felt that way. And I'd still be writing mask poems. I'd still be creating my costume. I would still be putting my rubber nose on and my face paint on every time I went on stage just to entertain people. And I don't think I could have lived like that for much longer. In that moment, I walked on stage and I realized I'm Benjamin Brindise. There was no one else that can tell my story the way that I can, and I am ready. I went on stage and I told them this story. I never figured out how to talk about you. I tried to write a poem. Instead, I remember what it felt like to hold you in my arms and not be able to keep your head above water. The sound of a gas motor chopping at the air. How do you describe when part of you dies and make that relatable to other people? What language do you choose? What comparisons do you draw? What imagery do you use to dress it up and make it pretty? I've wanted to package you up in words, lay you to rest outside of me all these years, but the boxes never fit past my teeth. Your dead weight still lays on me. I would like to push these skeletons back in my closet, spare myself the gory details, but that doesn't seem very honest. I am still afraid of the dark water. It runs through canals like veins of that city. I wake up and can hear it lapping against the side of a boat, cut down the middle, split in two by a tree. How do you tell them this is a poem about your father? I saved up all the money I made delivering papers the summer before I saw my father for the first time in 10 years. I used it to buy him dinner the day he died. I counted out the tip, 4 singles, 1 for each day I'd known him. They say nothing comes free. We took the boat home, an 18-foot Boston whaler, because in Fort Myers, the canals are veins, a secondary system of streets taking you where you need to go all the way to the end. I didn't know it then, but that day you'd say your last words. I carried them in my back pocket, a doctrine I chant to the sky when I need to be brave. That day you taught me courage. I hadn't needed it before. Life was neat and sectioned out the way it can only be when you were 13. I was afraid to put my feet in the water. You said, it's not about sure footing, kid. Wait, and you'll be waiting forever. It's about jumping in, especially when you're scared. 10 minutes later, time was frozen. I stood in the bow of that boat, facing the tree, a dark mass, rooted, ominous, and knew there was no escaping until I felt the scraping of your fingers on my forearms, remembered your last words, and jumped. I didn't feel the water until the darkness woke me up. I came to blood in the water that wasn't mine. I never saw you again, but I carry your last words in my back pocket. I think about you every time I need to be brave. There is no moment in my life that I feel the way that I do when I recite that poem to people. I feel whole. I feel like I am finally taking myself out of that box. I am taking the lid off, and I am showing people who I am. I am being transparent. I am letting the light through. I want to be understood. Thank you.